I want to invite you, if you have a Bible, to grab it and turn to the book of Ruth. This is what we've been working through. If you don't have a Bible, there's some on the table in the back. If you didn't get one of the journals last week that has the Word of God on one side and blank pages for notes on the other, there's some on the counter in the back in the library. You can certainly grab one of those and follow along. If you are a note taker, that's a great place to go. If you didn't get one of the postcards that has the beautiful artwork, this artwork on the front and then on the back, the rundown of how we're working through the book of Ruth, I'd encourage you to grab one of those as well. Our desire as a church is to be looking at God's word together, to be growing in our understanding of him and also our affections for him. So grab one of those note cards, and I'd encourage you to look at it. Be reading chapter 2 for next week of Ruth. Be prepared in that. I'd encourage you to even start taking down some notes, maybe writing out some questions, some observations of the text as we see the story of God unfolding and how he's leading his people, and our affections are growing for him. So I'm glad you're here this morning to look at God's word with us together. Last week, we started this journey through the book of Ruth, a very short book in the Old Testament. We started that with some background insight into the book and then jumped right into the first 5 verses that got pretty dark pretty quick. And so let me catch us all up and get us on the same page. Maybe some of you weren't here last week, or maybe you're new with us. Let me just get us all on the same page in case we're wondering what's going on. The story is this, that during the events of the book of Judges is where we pick up the story. In fact, in the book of Judges, it ends with this wording. It says, in this time period, God's people did not have a king. In fact, everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. They didn't have a ruler over them in that way, but God had given them judges. He had provided them judges that would help them, free them from those who were coming after them to attack them. And so after the book of Ruth that fits right in in the end of Judges, we get to 1st and 2nd Samuel, 2 books that tell us of God's plan to bring about a line of kings from Judah. Ruth is sandwiched in between Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel as this bridge. I think it's a gift from God to us because it's a short story that we can grab onto. And some of us, like me, need a story. We need something short and sweet to help us along to see what God is doing. So it's this bridge between the time period of the Judges and into the Kings. And the book of Ruth is a story of deep grief. And we started that last week. Deep grief that may cause the reader to begin to ask the question, where is God? And the title we've chosen for the series, A Grief Redeemed, in some ways mimics this well-known book by C.S. Lewis. Maybe you've heard of it, A Grief Observed. It's a compilation of writings put together from C.S. Lewis, an apologist, an author, a theologian. This compilation of writings that were put together after he lost his wife to cancer. And they're real and they're raw. And so his book was called A Grief Observed, and we've sort of mimicked that with this title. By the way, I've ordered a couple more copies. Those copies went quick last week. So if you're interested in reading that book, I think there are some in the back. And here's what we learned last week, that it's the story of Ruth that links us to the coming King David. This is God's king. And from this line of David comes the messianic Savior King, Jesus. And so this grief, and really our grief as we experience grief, is not just to be observed. It's not just a grief observed, but it's a grief to be redeemed. And we see that in the coming of Jesus. And so the stage is set in the first 5 verses of the book that during a time when the judges were ruling, so it was a time of rebellion and chaos, there was famine in the land. So heaped up on top of that, there was famine in the land, and God's people were experiencing all of this hardship. So Elimelech, a man by the name of Elimelech, takes off with his wife Naomi, and he has 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ikki and Sikki. As we learned the Hebrew this morning. And they take off across the Jordan River to the east side of the Dead Sea to find food. in Moab. An idol-worshiping enemy of God's people, Moab. And when they get there, it doesn't get better for them. Elimelech dies. It's excruciating news for Naomi. It's excruciating news for her boys, but there's glimmer at the end of their story. They think, okay, we can keep on our family name. And so the two boys marry two women, and they're Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. But after they marry these women, the two sons of Naomi die. It's a matter of 10 years. 10 years that they're living there. Naomi has gone through a lot. She's lost her homeland. She has lost her husband and all that represents for a woman in this day. She's lost her two sons and all that represents for the ongoing line of a family in that day. She's a grieving widow who has lost her children in a land not her own, now with two widowed, grieving daughters-in-law tagging along. Those first 5 verses are rough to get through, and it sets the stage for the book and what's to come, leaving us with lots of questions, leaving us with lots to sort through as we think through our own lives. I wish I could say that we get into chapter 1 and it gets a lot better, but as I sat down this week to begin to study, it doesn't. In fact, it's not about redemption, at least chapter 1. It's a chapter that leads us into a lot of hard things. But I think the rest of this chapter is going to meet many of us in places that we've experienced, we've felt, we've kind of gotten to that place. And so that's been my hope, that's been my prayer. In fact, in my experience of grief, the immediate moments after that tragic moment of grief, and many of you have experienced this as well, the immediate moments after that tragic event, whatever it is, adrenaline begins to kick in. And shock is still there. And you're sort of questioning all sorts of things, but your mind is going, and you're just stepping forward in the moment. I remember when, by the way, I don't keep bringing you into my story to try to drag you along in my grief or try to put me out front. I just do it because it's what I'm walking through, and so hopefully this is helpful that we can relate. But I remember the moments when we lost our son Ezra to this battle against cancer. Those moments right then. One of our sons, Asher, was with me when Ezra died, and it all just sort of crashed in. We began to gather Ezra's stuff together, which didn't take us real long, and we went out to the parking garage of Children's Hospital in Aurora and found the car, and it wasn't until we got 20 or 30 miles up I-25 that I began shaking my head and actually speaking out loud, what in the world just happened? Because adrenaline and shock were propping me up, were pushing me forward. In fact, I know it was adrenaline and shock because when I got home, what we decided to do as a family was go grab dinner and then, which is what all of you would do, go to Target and buy pickleball paddles and go play pickleball till like 10 at night. And so we think, what in the world just happened? We're running on adrenaline and shock, and here we are playing a game we've never played, but it's taken off, so join in. That's what happens. This adrenaline and shock are there. And as that adrenaline and shock begin to wear off, here's where I'm going with all that. As that begins to wear off, the really hard work begins. The work of trying to make sense of what has just happened. The work of trying to figure out how in the world are we supposed to respond to this. The work of trying to understand what's happened, how do I respond, how do I move forward? When adrenaline and shock have worn off, it's the moment where we really begin to think, what do I believe? Or what have I believed wrongly? Or what do I want to believe, but I can't get my head or my heart there? It's in those moments where we just have a tiny bit of space to process that we begin to try to respond or try to understand and receive what is there, where we bring together what we know to be true about God and what we feel about what God has now done. In those moments when we begin to try to understand our grief, the words we say, and you've probably experienced this, the words we say may not be fully formed. They may not be in their final stages of how you would then land truths about God. They will probably be raw with what may sound like more of a list of questions than a list of statements about God. And here's what happened. After our son Ezra died, the elders of this church graciously gave me time away to be with my family, to just be, to be away from carrying the burdens of ministry, which have been life-giving in so many ways, just to settle away from that, to give me space to try to process and grieve. And so after 3 or 4 months, I came back to the elders and I said to them, hey, I'm willing to step back into some of the roles I have. I'm willing to try to work at preaching again, but I want you to know that I may say some things that are not completely formed. I may say some things that are going to be some honest responses, but they may not be at the end of where they ought to go. So if you're willing to have me preach from where I am right now, I'm willing to give that a try. Now, whether this has been a good thing or not, I don't know. I don't want you to nod with that. But they agreed to that. And they said, I remember, I think it was Richard said, I think it could be really good for us as a church to process through these things together, for you to lead us as an active participant right now in grief, into trusting God in the midst of that grief. I think it could be really good for us. So, here we are. Naomi has lost her husband and her 2 sons, and she's stranded in a foreign, pagan culture, which I can imagine is desperately lonely. And this morning, we see Naomi respond. She responds to the grief that she's experienced. And not only do we see her respond, but we see her begin to explain what she feels like she is going through. And so my hope this morning, as we walk through again more hard things in chapter 1, is that we're learning from Naomi's response to grief, and we're learning from her explanation of grief. And they're not all good lessons, but I think we're going to learn some things along the way as we look out toward what will come in redemption. So I want us to look at chapter 1. If you would, please look at verse 6. We'll just start in some reading. Chapter 1, verse 6 says this: Then she arose with her daughters-in-law. This is talking about Naomi. Naomi arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. I want to stop right there and just point out again, Naomi's got to be desperately lonely. The only reason they went to Moab in the first place was to try to find food in the midst of a famine. And now her husband, whom she loves, and her sons, whom she cherishes, are gone. And she's the sole provider for herself and her tag-along daughters-in-law. She's alone in this. And she hears that God, her God, has provided, has intervened, and the Lord has shown his kindness, his steadfast love to his people, and he's given them food back in their land. And so with that news, she sets out from Moab with her daughters-in-law to return to Judah. And somewhere in the middle of that, we're not told when or how or what that journey looks like. Somewhere in the middle of that journey on their way back to Bethlehem, Naomi pauses to talk to Ruth and Orpah. And several times over, she works to convince them to stay in Moab. We'll read about it, to stay in Moab. And I think in all of this, we see her responses to grief. Naomi's responses to grief. We'll read through them. Look at verse 8. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return, each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you've dealt kindly with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." And then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Now, we're not told when in that journey this all happens, but something hits Naomi in this journey in a way that causes her to try now to dissuade the girls from going with her. And it's not just once, but over and over and over she tries. First, we see it in verse 8. She says, you know where I am here. You all should go back to your mother's house. Your moms are the ones who are going to be able to help you prepare for marriage and send you on your way with your new husband. Go back to your mother's house. Now that may sound atypical for this time because typically they would say go back to your father's house, meaning go back to your heritage. But she says very specifically, go back to your mother's house because it was known of the mother in that day that they would help prepare the girl to be married again, to find a husband and be married again. So in a sense, Naomi is recommending that the girls start over from scratch. And then Naomi speaks blessing over them. She says, may the Lord deal kindly with you. May the Lord extend steadfast love, steadfast kindness to you as you've dealt kindly with me. I want us to catch what Naomi is getting at here. I want us to see that she doesn't say, may the Lord deal kindly with you. You know, as he's dealt kindly with me. She skips right over that and she says, may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt kindly with me. And I think underneath all of that, we can see from Naomi, she's not saying, I've experienced the kindness of the Lord here. No, she's hoping that the girls would experience that. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you've dealt with me. And she continues in verse 9, may the Lord grant rest on you or freedom from worry about your future. Really, she's getting at this. My desire is that the Lord would give you a life with a husband from your own people. So go back home. I want us to remember what Naomi is walking through in her grief. It's a lot. We won't have to go back through it all. It's a lot. She's experiencing a lot. In fact, she's experienced Job-like pain in 5 verses. She's responding from her grief. Girls, why don't you go back home? You're better off there. You're better off in a land. You're better off in a way of life that worships false gods than you are with me. And so Naomi kisses them as if to send them on their way. There's a parting there, and they respond in this loud weeping, saying in verse 10, no, we're going with you back to your people. And a few things to notice. This is not a simple relocation for the girls. This is not a, hey, we like moving. We'll do that. It's warmer in the summer where you are. We'll go with you. This is not moving to a sunnier climate. They're telling Naomi emphatically. It has nothing to do with the land. It has everything to do with Naomi. We've become so attached to you through all of this pain and suffering that we've experienced that we plan to merge into you and your people. We're going. Grief does that, doesn't it? Walking through grief together, they're uniquely tied to one another. And you've probably experienced this to some extent. While those who are walking through grief would not have chosen in any way to go through that grief, they cannot now imagine anything other than the blessing of being together. You see this in times of war. Maybe you've seen movies or seen documentaries where you see these men who are in the trenches in war with one another, and all that they've experienced in the grief of losing other people, and they've become a tight group of brothers together. We've experienced this as a family, and everything that we have gone through, we've pulled together as a family, and I want to do nothing other than sit with my family and be with them. I think we've experienced this as a church, and all the things that we've walked through, we've pulled together as a people. Grief pulls people together, and Naomi responds to try to dissuade these two girls even more in verse 11. And she says again, same wording, turn back. Why would you go with me? And then Naomi gets a little bit snarky, a little sarcastic. I kind of like it. I like some sarcasm. She gets pretty harsh. Some sharp words. And she says, do I have sons in my womb that could become your husbands? It's really a sharp kind of wording that if we could understand the language, she's saying something like, I'm not just a womb factory to crank out husbands for you. It's that kind of crass wording that she has. So in verse 12, seriously, I want you to go back home. I'm too old to have a husband, and do what a husband and wife do together to bear children that would then become your husband. She goes on in verse 13, would you wait around, seriously, would you wait around until those children, those hypothetical babies that I can't even have, were grown up to be the age where you could then marry them? Is that what you're thinking? Let me just pause there and let us all in on something. That's a response to grief. She's grieving the loss of everything. The most intimate relationship of a husband has been a loss. The most precious relationship of her two boys has been lost. And she is now alone, away from her Bethlehem community. I'm not justifying her sarcasm. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not justifying the rude words that Naomi is speaking. I'm just saying this. It's expected. In the middle of grief, it's expected. So just a practical encouragement for us. In walking with someone in grief, can I encourage us, challenge us in this? Listen well. Listen. Allow the person who's grieving, experiencing pain, to speak what they are feeling. It's okay. As much as you're able, don't take what is being said in that moment. Don't take what's being said personally. You'll work through that. Relationally, you're with them. You're going to work through that in time. Just listen. Naomi's responding out of this grief. I would encourage us, grant some grace to the one who's in pain. Verse 13, I think, is telling. Naomi's grief isn't just this snarky, sharp words back to her daughters-in-law, but it's telling about her view of God. Do you see it? Verse 13. She says, girls, it's an extremely bitter reality. And this affects you. She tells them that. This affects you. It's an extremely bitter reality that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Naomi's view of God is clear. In the midst of her grief, she's blaming God for her pain. From her perspective, she is a victim of God. There is, I don't know if you see it, there is absolutely, from Naomi's mouth, there's absolutely no recognition of the possibility of her own sin or her own wrongdoing that's in need of repentance. She doesn't recognize that at all. There is no recognition that God's people have been rebelling against God for years and years and years. There is no recognition from Naomi that her family left the land that God graciously gave them to enter into, a foreign pagan land of God's enemies. There is no recognition that her sons have married against God's will, married Moabite women. There's no recognition from Naomi in that. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying what Naomi has thus experienced is punishment and discipline from God. That's not what I'm saying. But she doesn't even bring those words up as an option. In her grief, she moves straight into blaming God. Under God's cruel actions toward an innocent victim, I'm blaming you, God. Naomi's experienced grief. And she's now responding from a place of grief. And the girls respond back to her, weeping. And we're told in verse 14 that Orpah kissed Naomi. This is a quick peck on the cheek to cheek kind of thing. Okay, goodbye. So that's her goodbye. That's her way out. But what's it say of Ruth? Ruth clung to Naomi. Orpah leaves, but Ruth holds on with a tight grip. And so Naomi responds now just to Ruth. And she says in verse 15, Ruth, listen, your sister-in-law has returned to her people. What else does she say? And to her gods. She's returned back to her gods. Go back with her. Again, think through all that's going on here. Naomi, a God follower, is telling the wives of her two now dead sons that it would be better for these two girls to go back to their idol-worshiping lives than to stay with her. Implicit in that is this: your life with your false gods is better than this because look at what my true God did. It's a response out of grief. Questionable words coming out of her mouth in a moment of grief. It's understandable. And Ruth responds in what seems like more faith than Naomi. Do you hear that? Ruth responds in what seems like more faith than Naomi. She says, I'm not leaving you, Naomi. I'm going with you. I'm staying with you. I'll adopt the ways of your people with you. Listen, Naomi, you may have issue with your God in this moment, but he's your God, and if he's your God, I'm in. That takes some faith. I'll go with you to the end, Naomi. In fact, Ruth makes an oath with God. That's serious. She makes a vow with God, and she says, if I'm not faithful to Naomi, the Lord can do whatever he needs to do to come after me. In all of this, Ruth is claiming God to be her God. She is making a faithful commitment to God. And in all of this, we're told in verse 18, as all that scene wraps up, Naomi doesn't have words for that. She has nothing to say. Whether she realizes it or not, this is exactly what Naomi needs in this moment. In her grief, Naomi needs someone to cling to her, so to speak. She needs someone who will come beside her in absolutely everything. Hear this well. She needs someone to come beside her, not correcting her. She needs someone to come up with her and be with her and cling to her, not changing her, not correcting that moment, beside her. And so she says, I'll be with you and I'm not leaving you. Naomi needs someone whose faith is greater than hers to stand in faith for her. Naomi is responding from her grief as a bitter woman who, in her view, is a victim of God's wrath. And Ruth says, I'm with you. That's what we need in grief. I'm with you. So Orpah's gone, but Ruth remains faithful to Naomi and communicates her faithfulness to God in the process. And all of this leaves Naomi without a word to say. And so we finish out. Look at verse 19. It says, so the two of them, now just Ruth and Naomi, the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord's brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Naomi and Ruth roll into Bethlehem. Now, I want us to pull back here. 10 years, at least 10 years has gone by. They roll back into Bethlehem. The people in Bethlehem, which is called what? The house of bread. The people in Bethlehem have experienced famine. They've experienced no bread. And so when Naomi has come back now with Ruth to Bethlehem, 10 years later, she's remembering, I have no husband or my sons, and I've come back now without them, and I've got this Moabite woman tagging along, and we're told, of course we're told, that the whole town is stirred because of them. Asking, and it's the women who are asking, and I'm sure it's whispers, is this Naomi? Right? It's been 10 years. Think through that. 10 years. Things change. I talked to somebody before the first gathering, and they're like, it's kind of funny. When you look on the website for the church, you still have this picture of dreads. That was like a year ago. You had like waist-long dreads, right? That was a year ago. No, 10 years ago, who knows what my hair was like? 10 years, the people are without Naomi, and now she comes back into town. When Naomi left, she left with her husband and her 2 sons. She's now back without them, with a Moabite woman in tow, and the whole town is stirred. What we see in these final verses of the chapter are Naomi's explanation of grief. It's raw, but it's there, and I think it's coming from her heart. It's from her perspective, and it's in the middle of her grief, but she explains how she's now experiencing this grief, and she overhears what the women are saying, maybe her friends from the past, asking, is this Naomi? Is this really her? I'm sure she looks worn and weathered. Right? And so is this really Naomi? A name meaning pleasant. That's what her name means, pleasant. And Naomi overhears that and she says, no, don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. When I left Bethlehem, I was pleasant for sure. I was hopeful for a change. I was hopeful for a change to our situation in the midst of famine. I left this place pleasant for sure. I left this place pleasant. Naomi says in verse 20, but the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Don't call me by my given name, pleasant. My experience has changed me. I've been through hell, and it's changed me. Or rather, probably what Naomi would say is, I've been shoved through change. I've been forced to be changed. It's not my choice. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Naomi's explanation of her grief is to point her finger at the Almighty. Now, you may read that and say, hey, give her some slack here. She says Almighty. That sounds honoring. She's calling God the Almighty. But the word that she uses is an impersonal way to address God, kind of in this third person sort of way, that God. In fact, this word is used in only 40 times in the Old Testament, and most of those times it's used in the book of Job, where Job is like screaming at God, saying, that God did this. The one who's powerful, sure, he's the Almighty one, but look at what he's done to me. Naomi is explaining her grief, and in the midst of her grief, blaming that God. She continues in verse 21, yeah, I went away with a full life. Do you see that word full? Even in the midst of famine, I went away with the full life. My stomach wasn't full, but I went away with the full life. A husband I loved, 2 sons to carry on our name. We had the means to leave. Remember, she's looking at a group of people who didn't leave. We had the means to leave. I went away full. But the Lord is the one who has brought me back here empty. I want us to notice something that I don't think we notice in a time of grief, but I think it's true. And I'll put it in the form of a question for us to consider. If Naomi's saying I left full, can I ask this? How was Naomi's life full in the first place? Who provided her with that full life? Who? God. I think in the middle of grief, we don't recognize that what we had was also provided from God. It's extremely hard to recognize in the middle of pain. I would say it's extremely hard to recognize in the middle of prosperity that all this is from God. Even in the way that Naomi communicated it, she says, and I think we need to see it this way, I went away full. That was me and mine and what I secured. It was the Lord who brought me back with nothing. I made a good life for myself, but look what he has done. In the middle of our grief, our explanation of grief can be raw. It can be missing some significant truths about what's actually happened and lean primarily on what we're feeling. I had all of this. I had a good life. My life was full. I had made it, and God came in and he took all of that away from me. She goes on in verse 21, why would anyone call me pleasant? The Lord's testified against me. He's spoken out against me as the guilty party. And because of that, look, the Almighty, she's back to that God has brought ruin to me. From Naomi's perspective, she has been an innocent bystander and a victim in God's plot against her. She's responded to her grief with multiple attempts now to dissuade her daughters-in-law from going back with her. Don't come back with me. You've seen what happens when you're with me. I've got a target on my back, and if you stay with me, you'll be caught in the crossfire. This is from God. This is what we get. Don't come with me. In her grief, she has also worked to give an explanation, at least of what can come to her mind and what is going on. She's given this explanation to others about what's happened. I built a good life for myself, and look what God has done to me. This is hard. And it's hard because it hits close to home. I've been in this place where this is the response and the explanation that comes out. Maybe you've been in that place as well. I've maybe not been in a place where with my words out loud, those things are coming out to the people around me. but I've absolutely been there in my thoughts. I've absolutely been there in my journaling about my experience. Journals that will never be published, by the way. They'll never be available in our library. But I've been there in the ways that I've thought, and I'm sure many of you have as well. And I get to this place of understanding, recognizing that our response to and our explanation of grief says a lot about our view of God. It's all right that it's long. You got this. Our response to and our explanation of grief says a lot about our view of God. Maybe not in the moment. There's grace there. But if we hang on to that, it says a lot about our view. And friends, I hate to say this, but it's unfortunately true. And it's something that was brought to my attention this week by an author that I was reading. And it's this, that in the midst of our grief, there is often self-absorption. In the middle of our grief, the only thing we can think about is self, and that's understandable. In the middle of our grief, there's often self-absorption, and there's grace for that. There may not be grace from people around you. They're so selfish. How can they be that way? But there's grace from God. In the middle of our pain and loss, our eyes are naturally or humanly or maybe sinfully turned inward toward me. This is what we see. I see my pain and my grief. Our experience is pain, and that's all we can think about. Our only explanation for what we're experiencing is focused on how we're experiencing it, and we say some things that maybe we wouldn't land on, and all of that is understandable. And here's the problem, and this is the thing that hit me like a ton of bricks this week as I was reading from this author. And I don't want to hear this, but it's true. This self-absorption always, and I hesitate to use that word, but I'm going to use it. The self-absorption always blinds us from God's greater plan and the ways in which he's using even the smallest events in our lives to work out this plan. Let me say that again. The self-absorption that we experience when we're walking through pain and grief always blinds us from God's greater plan and the ways in which he's using even the smallest things to point us ahead to what he's doing. Let me say it a shorter way. The ways in which we only look at ourselves will blind us from what God's really doing, because all we can see is self. In our grief and our pain, we can only think about our grief and our pain. And it's understandable, but we also have to understand that leaves us blind to what God might be up to in the future. And I've experienced this. Maybe I still am experiencing this in some ways. Do I know that God is up to something bigger? Deep down, of course I know that. This life is not just about me. Do I know that he's up to something bigger? Absolutely. But in the middle of my pain, the pain that I'm experiencing, do I care? No way. Maybe the elders won't ask me back after that. No. My response to and my explanation of grief says a lot about my view of God, at least in that moment. And if that moment extends into my final view, it says a lot about my view of who God is. There are times I don't care if God's up to something bigger. I'm blind to that in the middle of my own grief and pain. And the remedy to that is not, hey there, Vince, you should think differently. You've been to seminary. You've read the Bible. You know what God's up to. You should think differently about that. Can I point out something that I think we see in the text? Ruth didn't bring correction to Naomi. She clung to Naomi. She cried with her. She vowed to stay with Naomi, even when she knew Naomi would not provide a happy story for her in providing a husband. She traveled the long journey back to Bethlehem with Naomi. You remember the map? It's a long journey. And you know that Naomi was talking the entire time, and Ruth listened. This connects to something I said last week that I'll push in a little bit again. If you're not in a place of grief and pain and loss right now, push into relationships right now. Because in the future, you will need them when you experience grief. You'll need a Ruth. You'll need someone to cling to you, so to speak. Better than that, and I want to point our attention to this as we close, better than a Ruth, you'll need an omniscient narrator. You know what that means? That omniscient narrator is the one who can back up from the story and tell about the events of the story from an outside perspective, knowing all things. You'll need an omniscient narrator like what we see in the final verse of the chapter. Look at it again, verse 22. The narrator says, "So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest." The narrator is tying up all of the loose ends. Naomi is blind to the greater plan of God in the midst of her pain, and that's understandable. And there's grace for that. But the narrator upholds the faith Naomi needs and the truth that Naomi will one day experience. In a way, the narrator says in verse 22, Naomi, you aren't coming back empty. You say you are. You have Ruth. That's not empty. And while Ruth does not replace your husband and your two boys, she never will. She stands in, though, as a testimony of God's unique faithfulness to you. She stands in not as one who ought to be allowed into God's family because of who she is, but God is faithful to bring in and hold on to those who trust him. Ruth is trusting. Ruth is a daily reminder to you, Naomi, of God's steadfast kindness to you, and not just to you, but generation after generation after generation. And we know from our perspective and from the bigger picture that because of the ongoing story, Ruth is the fulfillment of God's greater plan to continue Naomi's line, a line from the tribe of Judah that would bring about a king we know whose throne would be forever. Naomi is blind to all of that, but the narrator steps in and says, hold on. Ruth has to come back with you. It fulfills the story of what I'm putting together. Now we can relate to all of this, probably. Places where we've been, where we've thought, I'm responding in this way, I can explain it this way, and I know what's true, and it's out there, and I know that some narrator can put all the pieces together for me, and I know all of that. Yep, but I'm not feeling any of that. And we're blind in the moment because of what we're experiencing. We could, probably many of us, could probably quote what the Apostle Paul says in Romans 8. Words that very quickly come to mind where Paul says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. We could quote that and we could look out and say, yep, I know that's true. And while the truth of that verse is foundational to get us through moments of grief, it's foundational. It's got to be, it's the bedrock of what we experience and what we know is true that's out there. Listen, I cannot think of a time when that verse has been spoken in the moment of grief that it's been helpful. Just because we know it's true doesn't mean that it's going to change our feelings and what we're experiencing in the moment. Can I encourage us again? Listen. Listen. At some point, we all need to hear and we all need to be reminded of the truth of God's greater purposes in our lives, using the hard moments of grief in our own stories. And at times when we're unable to hear those words, we need an omniscient narrator who knows where the story is going and can uphold faith where we cannot. We'll need that. And it's all pointing us forward to the redemption that's coming. We wait for it, even though we grieve. And so with this story, With this verse in mind that's on the screen, I want to pray for us. Can we pray? God, you know what's going on in this room right now. You know what the people are experiencing who are here. You know the pain that they're feeling and the ways in which they've tried to work through a response of what they're feeling that holds together, hey, this is how I'm feeling, but this is what I also know is true. You know what's going on in the hearts and the minds of the people in this room right now. The tears that are being shed, the pain that's being felt, the things that are resurfacing, you know those things. And so my prayer, God and Father, is this, that you would be a very present help and comfort in this time of need. And for those who are in this space who are not yet or not right now experiencing pain, God, would you give them the courage and the desire to move toward people, to move toward those who may be hurting? Would you open up our eyes to the blindness we all may be experiencing in the midst of our struggle because all we can think about is us? Would you help us to see that you have a good plan, and that good plan is coming and being fulfilled in Jesus when he returns to restore all things, when every tear will be wiped away, where death will be no more, where weeping will be no more. Would you help us to long for that day, even though we can't yet feel it? We don't feel it now, but would you help us to long for that day? Comfort, God, I pray. Amen.